Mark Carney just directly confronted Donald Trump to his face, not through a later press conference, not via a scripted statement from another room, not through diplomatic back channels, parliamentary remarks, or policy moves issued from thousands of miles away. This was in person, in the same room, on camera, at the G7 Leaders Summit in Hiroshima, with every major democratic leader in the world watching around the table and an audience of roughly 400 million people following live from their homes. And what Carney said, calmly, methodically, without ever raising his voice, without anger, theatrics, or showmanship, left the room in complete silence and the White House, without an official response for 14 hours. The image is already iconic. It's on the front page of major newspapers across the globe this morning. Carney sitting forward slightly, speaking directly to Trump across the summit table, a bound report open in front of him. Trump opposite him, still, mouth slightly open, clearly processing something he did not anticipate and had no ready answer for. The poised Canadian Prime Minister and the wordless American President. Two leaders, one room, one table, and every person there and every viewer watching the broadcast realizing at the same instant that something fundamental had just changed. Not just in the trade dispute, but in how people perceive who truly holds power and who merely performs it. Warren Buffett called it the most revealing demonstration of negotiation dynamics he's seen in decades. After 70 years in boardrooms, Buffett said, "I have learned one absolute truth about confrontations. The person who is prepared always defeats the person who is confident, always. Confidence without preparation is performance. Preparation without confidence is unnecessary because the facts provide their own confidence. And that confidence, the earned kind, the kind that comes from knowing the numbers cold, is the only kind that survives contact with reality." But the line that will define this entire exchange, the line that sliced through all the diplomacy, posturing, and noise and landed in the heavy quiet of a room full of the most powerful people on the planet, was what Carney said directly to Trump when Trump tried to cut him off. 12 words delivered without frustration, without pause, and without any doubt about which side of the table was prepared and which was performing. I have the numbers, you have the talking points, the room knows. Once you understand how this meeting was supposed to unfold, what Trump expected, what Carney actually did with his 90 minutes, why the White House stayed silent for 14 hours, and what Buffett said about the core principle underneath all of it, you'll see why this wasn't just a diplomatic clash. It was the moment the world watched, in real time, the difference between power and preparation, and learned which one wins. Hit subscribe, because what happened in that room will be studied in diplomatic history, negotiation strategy, and political science for the next 50 years. Let's walk through how this happened, because the setting matters, the context matters, and what was supposed to occur in that room matters, precisely because it's the opposite of what actually took place. The Hiroshima G7 summit was scheduled months earlier as a standard gathering of leaders to discuss global economic coordination and security. But by the time they convened, the US-Canada crisis had overtaken everything else on the agenda. European leaders, Asian allies, and the host country had spent weeks urging, publicly and privately, a direct sit-down between Trump and Carney. The assumption was institutional optimism. If the two leaders could be brought together in the same room, surrounded by allied heads of state who could help guide the discussion, maybe the confrontation could be diffused before it caused lasting damage to the Western alliance. For weeks before the summit, there were back-channel negotiations between Washington and Ottawa. The White House insisted on a tightly controlled bilateral format, a structured meeting with pre-agreed talking points, a set time limit, and cameras allowed only for a brief opening segment before the room would be cleared for private talks. The Canadian side accepted the format, accepted the schedule, but, as would soon become obvious, did not accept the script. The White House had armed Trump with classic summit talking points, language crafted to project strength while avoiding real commitments, lines about the strong relationship between the two countries. Nobody respects Canada more than I do. Promises of fair terms and confidence that we're going to get there. Boilerplate. The communications plan was straightforward. Show engagement, project generosity, avoid concrete details, and leave the room having created the appearance of serious dialogue without giving up anything substantial. The press expected the usual diplomatic theater. A handshake, a photo op, then parallel press conferences where both sides would claim progress. That's what G7 bilaterals usually produce. The format is built to generate exactly that. Carney arrived with something else entirely, not talking points, not phrasing shaped by communications teams. He brought a dossier, a bound report said to be 147 pages, that laid out a comprehensive, data-heavy, carefully sourced analysis of every facet of the trade war. Economic impact on the U.S., category by category, economic impact on Canada, global economic costs, strategic losses, damage to alliances, human consequences on both sides of the border. It was organized not as a negotiating proposal, but as an evidentiary presentation, the kind of briefing a central bank chief delivers to a board when the institution is under severe stress. He had spent 2 weeks on it personally, working with economists, trade experts, and diplomatic strategists who knew this was not just a meeting, it was an opportunity. And opportunities of this scope do not come twice. The room followed the usual G7 bilateral setup. A rectangular table, Trump and Carney facing each other in the center, each flanked by their delegations. Flags behind each leader. Pool cameras at the far end for the opening statements. The other G7 leaders, France, Germany, the UK, Italy, Japan, and the EU president, were not at the table but were watching via live video from an adjacent room. More than 300 journalists from major outlets around the world watched the same feed from a media center 1 floor below. The room was warm, the lighting bright, and even for broadcast. Staff from both delegations stood along the walls behind their leaders. The atmosphere had the careful tension of high-stakes diplomacy, where every movement and expression can carry meaning. Carney was already seated when Trump walked in. The dossier was centered in front of him on the table, clearly visible. Cover up. Open to the first page. He waited. Trump spoke first, and for the first 90 seconds, everything matched the script. He delivered his opener with the ease of someone who's given thousands of public remarks and instinctively knows how to occupy a room. Broad, upbeat, confident. It's great to be here with Prime Minister Carney. Great. A lot of people said this wouldn't happen, and here we are. We have a tremendous relationship with Canada, a tremendous country, and I think we're going to work things out. I really do. We want fairness. That's all we've ever wanted. Fair terms for the American worker, fair terms for the Canadian worker, and I think Mark and I can find that. He gestured widely, speaking to the cameras as much as to Carney, playing the part of the generous leader offering the smaller partner a seat at his table. His posture was relaxed and expansive, the stance of someone who believes his presence alone controls the space. Staff along the walls nodded. Everything was on script. Then the White House press lead signaled to the camera pool to get ready to exit. The openings were wrapping and the cameras were supposed to leave. Then Carney answered. Within 15 seconds, everyone realized the cameras would not be going anywhere. He did not mirror Trump's warmth. He didn't smile. He didn't offer reciprocal praise about the tremendous relationship, didn't play along with the fiction that the previous 2 years hadn't happened. He fixed his eyes directly on Trump, not on the cameras, not on the aides along the walls, not on some neutral point in the room meant to project statesmanship, on Trump. And he spoke in a tone that room had never heard from him in a diplomatic context. Quiet, measured, completely free of performance. Mr. President, I appreciate the opportunity to speak directly, and I intend to use it not for pleasantries, for facts. Because the facts are what this conversation has needed for 2 years, and the facts are what I've brought. He rested his hand on the dossier. The mood shifted. Staffers along the walls glanced at each other. The press coordinator halted in mid-signal. The cameras stayed. Then Carney began. He talked for 22 minutes without being interrupted. 22 minutes of data, delivered with the clinical focus of someone used to briefing central bank boards and finance committees, rooms where showmanship is useless and only numbers matter. He started with the cost to the United States. No rhetoric, numbers. The tariff war's net drag on U.S. GDP, a cumulative 1.7% over 22 months, roughly $460 billion in foregone economic output. The energy suspension's impact on U.S. border states, $14.3 billion in emergency energy purchases, grid stabilization, and economic disruption in the first 90 days alone. Defense deal losses to American contractors, $480 billion in European procurements over 15 years diverted elsewhere, with $97 billion in immediate market cap losses across the defense sector. The Halifax corridor's projected impact on U.S. East Coast ports, $3.84 billion in our annual shipping revenue lost. The agricultural diversification's toll on U.S. food processors and consumers, $12 billion in the first 6 months. The potash tariff's effect on U.S. farmers, a 43% spike in fertilizer costs at planting, expected yield reductions of 15 to 25%, and a $3.66 billion windfall for the Canadian industry they were meant to harm. Every figure cited, every source named, every page turned at a steady pace, like someone who knows the document is doing the heavy lifting, and that the silence between each number is doing just as much. Then he moved to the cost for Canada. He didn't minimize it. Declines in Canadian GDP, real, measurable, painful. Job losses in affected sectors, documented. Disruption in communities, acknowledged. Families bearing the cost of a conflict they never asked for. He laid out Canada's losses with the same clarity he used for America's, because that honesty made the comparison impossible to spin. Canada had paid a price. The key question was whether that price had produced anything worth it. Then came the answer: Canada's trade diversification across 23 new markets, the Arctic Sovereignty Accord signed by 23 nations, the European Defence Partnership, the Halifax Trade Corridor, the agricultural export portfolio, now bringing in more revenue at better margins than the U.S. market ever had. Each gain set against the costs. The ledger balanced. The conclusion: Canada exited the trade war structurally stronger than it entered. The United States did not. Then, the global cost. Worldwide trade contraction, fragmented supply chains, Allied confidence in U.S. partnership at its lowest measured point since World War II. International bodies weakened, new multilateral structures built specifically to bypass U.S. unilateral moves. IMF projections, World Bank reports, cited by name, page numbers quoted, the data trail laid bare for anyone who cared to check. That's when Trump cut in. He leaned forward, waved his hand, the instinctive move of someone used to regaining control by filling the air, and said, "Those numbers are look, we've heard a lot of numbers, and frankly, our numbers are very different. And I think if you look at what we've done..." Carney stopped. He didn't talk over Trump. He didn't get louder. He didn't lean in or gesture or show any visible irritation. He gently put his pen down on the dossier and waited, calmly, like someone with all the time in the world, with the composure of someone who knows silence in a room full of powerful people is the most uncomfortable sound possible. Trump never finished the sentence. It just faded. The force behind the interruption dissolved into the quiet Carney had created. Quiet Trump couldn't fill, because he didn't have the substance to fill it. He had talking points, and talking points are built for rallies, press scrums, and friendly interviews, spaces where the speaker controls the time. They are not built for a room where the other person has 147 pages of sourced analysis and the discipline to sit through any interruption until the silence itself makes the argument. The silence held for 4 seconds. In a setting like this, 4 seconds might as well be an hour. Then Carney replied, "Mr. President, I have the numbers. You have the talking points. The room knows." What followed was absolute stillness, not people choosing not to speak, people unable to. The line wasn't shouted, wasn't personal, wasn't theatrical. It was a simple statement about the gap between two forms of preparation, and it felt like a verdict because everyone there, including Trump, including his own team, recognized that it was accurate. The numbers were in the dossier, the talking points were in the interruption, and everyone could see the difference. Carney went on. Trump didn't try to interrupt again. He outlined the strategic consequences, what the trade war had cost the U.S. in allies' trust, in Arctic access now closed off, in a European defense structure rebuilt without American centrality, in agricultural markets shifted to rivals unlikely ever to return, in a global impression now broadcast live from a G7 summit that American power was no longer anchored to American competence. Each point framed not as blame, but as a finding, like a financial controller presenting a report to shareholders, not a politician attacking an opponent. That distinction was crucial. Arguments can be debated. Audit findings can only be accepted or rejected. And rejecting a 147-page audit isn't a strategy, it's an admission. Then he turned to the human impact. U.S. farmers squeezed by fertilizer costs, Canadian workers who lost jobs in the early phases, port communities on both sides watching their livelihoods rearranged around them, families, American and Canadian, who'd done nothing but live in countries whose leaders couldn't bring the conflict to an end. Here, Carney's tone softened slightly, warmer, slower, enough to signal that behind every statistic was a person. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. Farmers, workers, families. That was the point. Then he laid out a way forward, specific and measurable. Technical schedules for rolling back tariffs, with timelines, steps for restoring diplomatic channels, frameworks for normalizing trade, energy cooperation terms, each framed not as a favor or demand, but as a structural requirement, like an engineer explaining what a bridge needs to stand, not what I want, but what the system requires. He closed the dossier. The soft thud of the cover was audible on the live feed. He looked at Trump one last time. "Mr. President, I did not come here to negotiate." Negotiation requires both sides to bring something to the table. I came to present the facts because the facts have not been part of this conversation for 2 years. They are now. Every number in this document is sourced, cited, and verifiable. What you do with them is your decision, but the facts themselves are no longer in dispute. They never were. They were just never spoken aloud in a room where you were present. Now they have been. He leaned back. The room stayed frozen. 3 seconds. 5. 7. The silence stretched so long that no one wanted to be the first to speak. In the adjacent monitoring room, Japan's prime minister, the summit host, shifted in his chair but said nothing. Camera operators held their positions. Behind Trump, a senior White House aide was already typing furiously on a phone, the start of a response that would take 14 hours to materialize and satisfy no one when it did. Then finally, people began to breathe again. The other G7 leaders' reactions in the viewing room were noticed and reported within minutes. France's president turned to Germany's chancellor and said, according to 2 journalists near the door, "That is the most extraordinary thing I have witnessed in 15 years of summits." The UK Prime Minister reportedly sat absolutely still for several seconds, then quietly told an aide, "He just changed the room." Japan's Prime Minister said nothing, but observers saw him nod once, slowly, a single gesture that carried the weight of everything he chose not to voice. Trump's response, or lack of one, became the second most discussed element of the meeting. He didn't rebut. He didn't present alternative data. He didn't hold up a binder of his own. He closed with a brief, muted remark. Well, we'll see. We have a lot of very good people looking at all of this, and we'll see what happens. It was delivered in a noticeably different tone from his upbeat opener. Flatter, quieter. The swagger that had filled the room earlier had been replaced by something else. Not outright defeat, something more damaging for someone whose entire public career rests on projecting dominance. A sense of being sidelined, as though the room had moved past him, and the real conversation was now between Carney's dossier and the world, with Trump not as a participant, but as the subject. The White House waited 14 hours before issuing any official comment. In an administration known for reacting to events within minutes, often seconds, via social media, that silence became its own headline. When a statement finally did appear, it read, President Trump had a productive meeting with Prime Minister Carney and looks forward to continued discussions on trade and economic issues. 17 generic words that addressed none of Carney's substance, cited none of the data, and acknowledged nothing about what everyone had just watched. Commentators noted that the statement could easily have been drafted before the meeting, and very likely was. That's why what Carney did was ultimately more damaging than any loud confrontation, and why it will be analyzed for decades. Trump's style of dominance relies on a familiar pattern honed over many years. He raises the temperature. The other person either raises it too, creating a fight Trump can try to win through sheer force of personality and a willingness to escalate, or they back off, which he treats as surrender. Those are the two lanes in Trump's model: escalate or submit, fight or fold. He's ready for both. Carney chose neither. He didn't escalate. He didn't retreat. He opened a binder and started reading numbers. And there is no dominance-based counter to a spreadsheet. You cannot bully data. You cannot outperform a balance sheet. You cannot fill the space after a hard statistic with charm and have it matter. By framing the entire exchange as an audit instead of a clash, Carney took the personal dynamic out of play. An audit doesn't require agreement. It doesn't require engagement. It only requires that the other side listen. And when the auditor has a 147 pages and the subject has nothing but talking points, the room reaches its own verdict. Buffett watched all of this and focused on the underlying rule. There are two things people bring to confrontations, he said: confidence and preparation. They are not the same thing. Confidence is a feeling. Preparation is a fact. Confidence says, I will prevail because I always prevail. Preparation says, I will prevail because I have done the work. Confidence without preparation works in rooms where nobody pushes back. It works on stages. It works on television. It does not work in a room where someone across from you has done the work you haven't. Because when the prepared person starts, when they open the binder, when they quote the figure, when they turn the page, confidence has nothing left. It can interrupt, dismiss, wave a hand and say the numbers are wrong, but it cannot produce its own numbers because it didn't bring any. He's seen this dynamic for 70 years in corporate boardrooms. The CEO who comes in with a strong handshake and total confidence. The activist investor who comes in with a thick stack of analysis. Every time, Buffett said, every single time, the binder wins. Not because the activist is smarter or more powerful, but because the binder is right. And being right in any room, in any confrontation, in any negotiation, is the only advantage that grows instead of shrinks. Confidence shrinks. Every minute you talk without evidence, the room's belief in you drops. Preparation grows. Every data point, every citation, every page turned, the room's trust in you rises. Trump walked into that room confident. He's always confident. Confidence is his main tool. It has carried him through press events, rallies, and negotiations where the other side was less prepared or easier to overwhelm. But confidence has a built-in weakness. It only works in spaces where no one has done more homework than you. The moment someone across the table has dug deeper, compiled better data, built a stronger analysis, and spent more hours getting ready for that specific encounter than you have, your confidence stops being an asset and starts exposing you. Confidence without substance suddenly looks like what it is: performance. And Carney refused to play the part that performance needed. He didn't argue, which would have given Trump the fight he knows how to play. He didn't cave, which would have given Trump the submission he knows how to claim. He opened a document and conducted an audit. And audits don't care how confident you are. They care if you're accurate. The audit was accurate. The room knew that 5 minutes in. Trump knew it when his interruption died out into silence. The world knew it when the White House stayed quiet for 14 hours. Trump was depleting.